Okay, the recording has started, everyone. Tom.
Hey, thank you, Lou. Welcome to everybody. Those who are returning, who were with us on earlier sessions in this year's Great Decision Series, and a special welcome to those who have joined in, especially for this, our fourth session. That before introducing our speaker for this evening, I want to note that recordings of the sessions are available on the First Church website. That recordings of both the session on Russia and Ukraine and the one on Biden administration foreign policy are available. This evening's talk will be posted as soon as we can get it up there, for those of you who like to go over things a second time. This evening, we have another complex and in many ways tragic subject, but one that receives much less coverage in American media. That subject is the situation in Myanmar, which, as many of you doubtless know, was formerly known as Burma. And Myanmar's relationship with, or interaction with, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. Our speaker this evening is extremely well qualified to address the issues involved. And I am very grateful that Scott Marcial has agreed to join us this evening. Scott is a career Foreign Service officer with extensive experience in Southeast Asia. He's currently a visiting fellow at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford. But before joining us at Stanford, he served as the U.S. ambassador to Myanmar from 2016 to 2020. Other Foreign Service assignments include ambassador to Indonesia and ambassador to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as well as being a principal deputy assistant secretary of state for East Asia and the Pacific, and numerous other assignments, most of them dealing with Southeast Asia. His career and our friendship warrant a much longer introduction, but I don't want to detract from his time to speak to you and your time to ask questions. So I'm going to stop right here and turn the program over to Scott, noting that you can post a question at any time, but I will collect them and moderate them at the end of Scott's formal talk. So Scott, over to you.
Tom, thanks very much, and Tom and Lou, and thanks everyone for inviting me and giving me a chance to talk to you about the situation in Myanmar. I'm going to do something I don't normally do, which is put up some slides which sort of highlight or outline the presentation, but I've also included a couple of maps and some photos for those of you who've never been to Myanmar or maybe never been to Southeast Asia. I thought it might be useful just to kind of give you a feel for what it actually looks like. So I won't go on at length with slides, but I thought it might be useful. So let me go ahead and put share screen on. Okay. I think all of us, myself included, have obviously been focused, to the extent we've been looking at the world for the last few weeks, obviously been focused on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and just how horrific it is, and the incredible brutality and indiscriminate shelling, bombing that the Russians are carrying out in Ukraine. Kind of the same thing is happening in Myanmar, and has been for the last 13 months now. It's not an invasion by one country of another. Rather, it's a takeover, a coup by the Myanmar military in February of 2021 that was basically been rejected by virtually the entire population of the country. And the military, in response to strong protests, has basically tried to terrorize people into submission with incredible brutality. Same things you're seeing in Ukraine: artillery, fired into civilian areas, jets bombing, I mean, literally bombing their own people, horrible cases of people being arrested, tortured to death, men, women, children. And this, this is a country of 54 million people. And it's just absolutely horrific. You never want to compare horror stories, but I would say it's on a par with what we're seeing in Ukraine, even if the circumstances are different. And like the Ukrainian people, the people of Myanmar are unbowed. They're not easily intimidated or terrorized into submission. And there's been incredible stories, daily stories of sacrifice and of courage, just like what we see in the Ukraine. The world reaction, though, as Tom suggested, has not been the same as what we've seen in Russia and Ukraine. One, because a lot of people don't even know where Myanmar is or what it is, and you don't get much press in there that actually can show what's happening. And second, I think because it's not an invasion, which tends to get more attention for obvious reasons. And second, there's no Vladimir Putin. Instead, you've got a number of generals on the Myanmar side who are every bit as awful as Vladimir Putin, but much less recognizable. And so I think gets a lot less attention. And the outcome is uncertain. So tonight, I'm going to talk about that, what's happening, why it's happening, and the connection to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, of which Myanmar is a member. So really briefly, what I'm going to cover is, how did Myanmar get to this point? What's happening right now? Who are the players inside Myanmar? And why are many people looking to ASEAN to try to resolve this crisis? And then, what is ASEAN and how does it work? What ASEAN's trying to do. And then I'll finish with my very personal views of the prospects for Myanmar. Let me start with really basics, and forgive me if this is stuff you already know, but since so few people, even well-informed people, so few people know much about Myanmar, I'm going to just take a couple minutes to go over some basics. As you can see here on the map, it's located basically in the Bay of Bengal in the Indian Ocean, between Bangladesh and India to its west, Thailand, Laos, and China to its east and northeast. So it's in a pretty strategic location. When you look at the map, this one doesn't show it ideally. It's important to remember, as I said, there's 54 million people in the country. The majority is the so-called Burman or Bamar ethnic community. They tend to inhabit basically the center of the country, the lowland center of the country, and they're almost all Buddhist. On the borders to the east, northeast, and to the west, you have literally hundreds of different ethnic minority populations. They're not only in the borders, but they tend to be mostly in the border areas where they often make up the majority. And these, again, it's an incredibly diverse country, the second most diverse country in Southeast Asia after Indonesia. Diverse in terms of ethnicity and in terms of religion. Again, most people are Buddhist, but you have a substantial Christian minority in the west and the northeast and the east, many of whom were actually became Baptist after American Baptist missionaries spent a lot of time there. And the history is critical, and I'm going to get into that more in a minute. But first, I'm going to run through really quickly just maybe a dozen slides, just to give you a feel. What does the place look like? And these are sort of random photos that I had in my own photo library. So this is the Shwedagon Pagoda, which is kind of the Buddhist heart of the country. It's in the capital of Yangon, formerly known as Rangoon. This is just a street scene in Rangoon. This is kind of what it looks like. This is a photo of the old royal capital of Bagan. Again, literally hundreds of Buddhist temples. This is an almost sacred place for many people in the country. This is an example of the diversity. I don't actually know what ethnic group these women are from, but you can usually identify the ethnic group by the headdress they wear. But in this particular case, I'm not sure. This is me out in the east, in Karen state near the Thai border. And these people are from the so-called Pa'o ethnic group. And these are people who had been growing opium, but under a program that the US government was sponsoring, they had shifted to produce and sell coffee. This just gives you a little feel for, the countryside, how beautiful it is. This is again out in the east. Another Buddhist temple, you'll see monks, Buddhist monks like this. They're very influential in the country, not usually directly involved in politics, but very revered and influential. This is a woman from the Padang ethnic community. You can see they're well known for the wearing the neck bracelets that elongate their necks. And this, because food's important, this is one example of what Myanmar food looks like. Another street scene from the capital. This is a lake up in the eastern area of the country. And last, like everywhere in the world, kids going off to school. So that's enough of the tourist slideshow, but I thought maybe it would be helpful just to give you a little feel for it. So how did Myanmar get to this point of intense conflict and instability? A historian, probably the most prominent historian of Myanmar, is a fellow named Thant Myint Oo, who's actually Western educated. He's the grandson of the former UN Secretary General U Thant. And he talks about Myanmar as an incomplete nation. And what he means by that is that with all these different ethnic communities, there's never been a shared sense of what it means to be a person of Myanmar. If you go to the United States or Indonesia or whatever, you'll meet people from all kinds of different backgrounds, including different ethnicities, different religions, but they're most likely going to say, well, I'm an American, I'm an Indonesian. Not in Myanmar. They're going to identify themselves first and foremost by their ethnic identity, and often by their religious identity. So there's never been really a unified sense of nation in the country, and that's critical. What you've had instead is, at least since the early 1960s, situation in which the dominant and majority ethnic Bamar have basically ruled and tried to force everybody else to assimilate. The ethnic minority communities have rebelled. There's more than 20 armed ethnic groups representing different ethnic communities, and have basically been fighting against the central government for decades. I mean, really going back to the late 1940s in some cases. It's the world's longest running civil war. In 1962, the military seized power, really to prevent any discussion about forming a federal state in which the ethnic communities might have more say in their affairs. And so this was a coup that not only created a dictatorship, but also really sought to impose the will of the ethnic Bamar on the rest of the country. What you saw from really 1962 to about 2010 was 50 years of horrific rule by the military, brutal oppression of the ethnic minorities, but also of anyone, even Bamar people, who protested against them or sought to form their own parties or what have you. But it went beyond brutality. It was just about as bad governance as you can have. They ruined the economy. They closed the country off largely to the world, ruined the economy, ruined the healthcare system, ruined the education system, took what had been a reasonably well-educated civil service and ruined it. So the country went pretty steadily downhill for a good 50 years. And this is linked to something that's really critical to what's happening right now, the military's view of itself as the only institution that can keep the country unified. And even though the facts and the realities of the situation would suggest they're not actually keeping the country unified, the military tends to believe, or not tends to, they do absolutely believe that they're an essential institution. And the other underlying factor to highlight is an incredible lack of trust. Distrust certainly of the military, but distrust certainly from the ethnic minority communities toward the majority Myanmar. And this becomes very relevant to the things that we're seeing today. Really, for decades now, you've had, in a way, two conflicts. The one I mentioned of these multiple ethnic minority armies fighting, in theory, for independence, but what they're really asking for is a fair amount of autonomy so that they can elect their own leaders, basically the equivalent of state level. They can teach their own languages in school. They can celebrate their history, which they haven't been able to do, these sorts of things. So you have that sort of civil conflict or civil war conflict there. And the second conflict has been between the military and the so-called pro-democracy forces, most notably the Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi. Aung San Suu Kyi is the daughter of really the founder of modern Burma, Aung San, who was a general in the 1940s and really fought for independence of the country. Since the late 1980s, Aung San Suu Kyi has come to symbolize that, pro-democracy opposition to military rule. She won the Nobel Peace Prize basically for refusing to bend to the military. They kept her detained under house arrest. Even when her husband was dying of cancer, they wouldn't let him come to visit her, trying basically to convince her that she should go outside of the country to visit him, and then she would never have been allowed back in. So her courage and sacrifice in being away from her husband and kids for decades under house arrest kind of made her not only a national but really an international hero. So the background to what we're seeing now is these two conflicts. Then in 2011, a surprising thing happened. The military had an election in 2010, which was kind of a joke. We all wrote it off as a joke. They elected one of the senior generals to be president. Most of the Democratic opposition boycotted it. The world didn't take it seriously. And then about a year later, much to everyone's surprise, this general began opening things up. He released political prisoners. He carried out reforms. He welcomed increased engagement with the United States and the rest of the world, allowed free press, allowed civil society to take off, did a lot of economic reforms, began a peace process to try to finally end the civil war that had been going on for so many years. And it even released Aung San Suu Kyi from house arrest and allowed her and her party to run in parliamentary by-elections in, now I've forgotten if it was 2013 or 2014, but anyway, and she ran and she won. She became a member of parliament. So it was shocking. We were shocked, and the people in the country were shocked. And I think what happened is the military allowed this because they saw how bad things were in the country, and they didn't want to become too dependent on China, which was a real risk. So they thought they could have a controlled opening that they would be able to manage. And I think when things started moving and the world welcomed it so much, I think the president at the time, former General Thein Sein, my own sense is he said, this is kind of nice. I'm getting a lot of applause. I'm getting invited to travel around the world. Maybe I'll do some more of it. So maybe they took it a little bit further than they had planned. But for the people of the country, it was a huge step forward. I mean, it was going from a situation where things were just horrible on every front to a situation in which things were at least getting better, in some cases quite rapidly. Then in 2015, you had national elections, the first real competitive national elections. the military under the constitution that they had written was guaranteed 25% of the seats in parliament. So they knew they would be in pretty good shape. They only had to really win 25% more to be able to name the president. They had an indirect election system. So parliament would pick the president. So Aung San Suu Kyi and her party, the National League for Democracy, ran. The whole country rallied behind them and they won a landslide victory. And we kind of held our breath to see if the military would allow the election to happen, but then respect the outcome, and they did. So in March of 2016, Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy took office as the ruling party. And that was coincidentally, I showed up that week to begin my ambassadorship. So it was a time of euphoria. I mean, people were literally dancing in the streets. They were so excited. They kind of couldn't believe this was happening. It was an incredible period. The military remained in control of the military. So the civilian authorities didn't have any oversight of the military, which turned out to be a huge problem. But at the time, the trends were so positive that many of us were hopeful that the reforms would continue. So the Aung San Suu Kyi government went for about 4.5 years. And they did some good things, and it was a period of a lot of openness and relative freedom. And the first year particularly went quite well, to the point that President Obama invited her to the White House, Aung San Suu Kyi. We lifted sanctions, which we had had on the country for years, to try to help them move ahead. And things looked really promising. Then in 2017, you had yet another crisis, the Rohingya crisis, which I'm sure many of you have heard about or read about. I can go into more detail in the Q&A if you want, but in brief, the Rohingya community is a group of maybe 1.2 to 1.4 million people living in Western Myanmar, in Rakhine State, right near the Bangladesh border. And probably for most of them, their forefathers had come over from what's now Bangladesh during the British colonial period, when there wasn't no real border there. And the Rohingya are ethnically different and they're religiously different. They're Muslim. And over the years, the military has engaged in a pretty ugly propaganda campaign to portray the Rohingya as a threat to the country. In racist terms, but also in terms of, if we're not careful, these Muslims are going to take away our Buddhism and take over the country. So it's a group that I have to say, sadly, the vast majority of the Myanmar population feels a lot of antipathy and prejudice toward. And they were treated, basically they faced institutionalized discrimination, not all that different than what Black South Africans faced under apartheid. It's pretty awful stuff. In the middle of 2017, as we, the international community, was putting pressure on the government to address this discrimination, a small group of Rohingya rose up and attacked security forces. And this was presented in the Myanmar press as ISIS has come to Myanmar. These terrorist Muslims are trying to take over our country. And the response from the military was a brutal campaign to go in and burn hundreds of villages and drive out more than 700,000 people from the country into Bangladesh. It was very, very horrific, ugly stuff. We called it ethnic cleansing. Some have called it genocide. People can debate that, but either way, it was truly awful stuff. The ugliest stuff I've ever seen in my career, for sure. So when that happened, the world, much of the world at least, reacted with outrage and said, this is unacceptable. And we looked to Aung San Suu Kyi, this Nobel Peace Prize winner and human rights icon, to speak up for the Rohingya. She didn't. She and her government basically denied the allegations of human rights violations, and in effect, said the military is doing the right thing. So the military was carrying out terrible human rights violations, but the rest of the country seemed either not to believe it or not to mind it too much. So it was a very difficult period, and one that certainly meant that Aung San Suu Kyi lost her luster in much of the world, but not inside the country where she remained very popular. Anyway, I left the country about 6 months before the coup, and it was a time when it was still reeling. We were still reeling from this Rohingya crisis, and where the euphoria of the past had certainly, of the recent past, had certainly gone away, at least from the world's point of view. And some in Myanmar too were discouraged because it turned out that the Aung San Suu Kyi government, in addition to its handling of the Rohingya crisis, also was not really moving ahead on political reforms, and in fact was using some of the old laws to to crack down on press and even civil society and opposition. So it was a disappointing period. That said, things at the end of 2020 for most people in the country were dramatically better than they had been 10 years ago. Much more freedom, much more opportunity. People could travel, people had access to the internet, which they hadn't had before. The economy was growing pretty rapidly. Jobs were opening up, businesses were opening up. There was reason to be hopeful despite the problems. Then you had elections in November of 2020. It was really, again, Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy Party running against the military-backed or military-aligned party, the USDP, and a range of, there were literally 100 different political parties in the campaign. The military was pretty hopeful that they were going to do well, or that its party, USDP party, was going to do well, because they knew that a lot of people were disappointed with Aung San Suu Kyi, particularly the ethnic minorities, whom she hadn't really done anything for. But surprise, the NLD won an even larger landslide in this election. And in my view, that was largely because people said, we may not be thrilled with Aung San Suu Kyi's government, but anything's better than going back to the military. So the military, taking I hate to say it, and I don't want to get into partisan US politics, but clearly stealing a page from what was happening in the United States in terms of our elections, claimed that the elections had been rigged and that they were fraudulent, and that they needed to be redone with the military managing them. Aung San Suu Kyi rejected that, and you know, there's no evidence that the military's claims were valid. I'm sure there were flaws, but nothing significant. Anyway, the military kept complaining, and then on February 1st, they rolled their tanks in and took power. They arrested Aung San Suu Kyi and most of the leadership of the country, most of the members of parliament, any activists they could lay their hands on, and they basically said, we're in charge now, and because those elections were no good, we're going to set up new elections that will be fair, and we're going to improve the economy, and oh, by the way, we're going to really handle this COVID situation. And I think they were looking very much to the model of Thailand, which in 2014 had staged, where the military had staged a coup. And then over the next 2 or 3 years, basically managed the politics so they could have elections that they were pretty much guaranteed to win, but without really any significant bloodshed. So I think that was the model that these generals had in mind. And I don't think they expected much opposition. And it's important to keep in mind that the military in Myanmar really has almost sealed itself off from society. So there's very little interaction at senior levels between the military and everybody else. And so they're frankly pretty clueless about what their own countrymen think. And they have a long record of exaggerating their own popularity and underestimating how much people want freedom and democracy. That's what happened. Basically, after the coup, nearly the entire population of the country said, no, we don't accept this. There were massive protests. I wanted to put up some pictures of them, but they're all copyrighted, and it was just getting too complicated to get pictures I could use. Massive protests all over the country against this, demanding freedom, demanding the release of all the people who'd been detained and the military out of power. And at the same time, the public really launched what they call the civil disobedience campaign, which is refusing to work for the military junta that had taken power. In Myanmar, the civil service includes not only your normal ministries and so on, but teachers, healthcare workers, doctors and nurses, and many more. So it's a really big part. And led by the healthcare workers, there was this huge campaign that said, no, we're not working for you. Most of the ethnic armed groups also rejected the coup. Some kind of just kept their mouths shut. Others said, no, we don't accept this either. And so you have this formation of this, almost immediately, this strong public opposition combined with a pressure campaign through the civil disobedience to put pressure on the military to relent and go back to the barracks. Within a few months, I don't want to call them the opposition because that suggests that the junta somehow has some legitimacy, but those who had been elected and others who had been involved, activists and the like, formed a national unity government and then a national unity consultative committee to basically be what they're calling it a shadow government, which isn't quite the right term, but basically an alternative government, one that they argue correctly has a lot more legitimacy and credibility. So it was a pretty dramatic reaction. The military then responded the way, sadly, the military in Myanmar always does: brutality. Let's force these people into submission. So they started opening fire on peaceful protests, including in Yangon, killed a bunch of people, men, women, children. They weren't too careful with their targets. They just started shooting. They arrested thousands of people involved in the civil disobedience.
9:45 and it's 9:15.
I think someone's.
I'm sorry, Scott. Len and Paulette, would you please mute yourself? Len and Paulette, please mute yourself. Thank you.
Oh. Thank you, sorry.
No problem. So they arrested thousands of people who were involved in the civil disobedience campaign, anyone who they thought was involved in protests at all. And I don't want to get into the gory details, but they would go in looking for an activist. They couldn't find him. They'd arrest his or her parents, children, basically take them as hostages. In some cases, torturing children to death. It was just and because they're still doing it, just the most unspeakable crimes imaginable. They shut down the independent media. They shut down civil society. They shut down the internet. And they've run nonstop and really bad propaganda, trying to paint a completely different picture of the reality. Nobody really believes it, but that's what they do. So it's just a horrific series of human rights violations that continues to this day. So what do we see right now? It's been 13 months since the coup. Population remains largely united against the coup. Again, there's no opinion polls, but you can just see it in how people are behaving. There's still protests. They tend to be smaller and quicker now because they know they'll be gunned down if they organize mass protests. Still significant participation in the civil disobedience movement, which is really hurting the junta's ability to govern. There is a growing armed resistance as well. So a lot of people, they said, well, we tried peaceful protests, we were attacked, so our only option is to take up guns. And so in addition to the ethnic armed groups that were already fighting against the military, you've had development of probably a few hundred, sometimes pretty small groups called People's Defense Forces that are in theory tied to the national unity government, although I don't think the national unity government really exercises much direct control over them. And they're ambushing the military, killing informants, really putting a lot of pressure on the military. The military's response is to intensify its brutality. Just in the last few weeks, they've been up in the north of the country where there's been a lot of resistance. And they're basically just like what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. They're just bombing towns and villages into rubble and killing however many people they kill. They don't care how many people they kill. The economy's crumbling. It's dropped, GDP's dropped at least 20-25% since the coup. There's a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions, tens of thousands of people displaced, many of them crossing over into India or Thailand, but many of them just moving into forested areas to escape military shelling. Even people who haven't been displaced, often lacking food. The military has weaponized COVID so that in order to get a vaccine or any kind of treatment, you had to have the approval of the local military appointed neighborhood watchman. In other words, anyone who was suspicious basically was just told, sorry, you can't get any treatment. Medical workers who refused to work for the junta, but were helping people suffering from COVID, were attacked and killed by the military as traitors. The military right now is facing unprecedented pressure. It's being stretched really thin. And neither the military nor those resisting it are interested in compromise or dialogue at this point. It's open. It's a zero-sum game at this point. The players, the military, obviously, Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD party, although she and the senior leadership of that party has been locked up for 13 and 14 months. So it remains just, I think she's still probably the most popular politician in the country, but it's hard to know. The National Unity Government, the National Unity Consultative Committee, as I mentioned, the ethnic armed groups, which are hugely important, and a whole generation of younger activists who have led the civil disobedience movement, started the People's Defense Forces, organized protests, and so on, and who no doubt, if the military is ever defeated, will want to have a say in the future of the country. Okay, now I'm going to shift to ASEAN. What does ASEAN have to do with it? So ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, was established in the 1960s, originally just by 5 countries, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and the Philippines. And it was really meant to bring the region together. This is only 10 or 20 years after most of them had gotten independence. And they got together to try to basically manage tensions and mistrust among themselves, because they were afraid if they didn't, then the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union at the time, would come in, intervene, interfere, and they didn't want that. So it's kind of a way of keeping the big powers out. Over time, ASEAN expanded. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Brunei all joined, and then Myanmar joined in the late 1990s. And ASEAN invited Myanmar to join, even though the government was really bad, because they were afraid if it didn't join, it would basically become a vassal state of China, and they didn't want that. ASEAN is an interesting organization. It's not like the UN, it's not like the European Union. It's not a supranational organization in the sense that it does have a secretariat and a secretary general, but they're not very powerful. So it really is more of a forum where the 10 countries of ASEAN can get together and talk and try to work things out. The tradition is to solve the problems within the ASEAN family kind of quietly. And in this case, the world kind of looked to ASEAN after the coup and says, okay, ASEAN, Myanmar is a member state, look what's happening. You guys always insist that you're supposed to solve those problems, so we'd welcome you to go ahead and try. Now, honestly speaking, a lot of that's because the rest of the world, including the United States, didn't have a lot of great ideas on how to solve the problem. And so everybody was hoping that ASEAN would come up with some magic bullet. Magic bullet is probably a bad term to use, some solution. This is the 10 states of ASEAN here, just so you know. So Myanmar up on the far west, and you see China looming to the north, and Australia to the south, and India is just off to the west. So Indonesia is the big, most powerful country in yellow at the bottom. And you've got the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand as well. So ASEAN had a summit in April of 2021 to talk specifically about the coup in Myanmar and what to do. So this was just 2 months after the coup. And they reached agreement on 5 principles or 5 key points: an immediate end to the violence, dialogue between the military and the, if you will, the democratic forces, that the military would allow any humanitarian aid, that ASEAN would have a special envoy who would go in and try to help foster a dialogue and a solution, and that there would be a visit by a delegation from ASEAN to try to see what could be done. The Myanmar military, I should say that the general who leads the military is a general named Min Aung Hlaing. He's a horrible man. I know him reasonably well. And a lot of people have personalized this as all about him. As I said, he's a horrible man, but he more reflects the institution. It's not all about him, I would say. Anyway, Min Aung Hlaing agreed to these 5 points, went back to the capital of Naypyidaw in Myanmar and said, what are you talking about? We never agreed to this. We're not allowing you to have any of this stuff. So it was yet another lie by the generals. So ASEAN's been struggling really for the last year, trying to figure out what to do. They have said, because of the lack of progress on these 5 points, we're not going to let a junta representative attend ASEAN meetings, which, might not seem like a big deal, but in the ASEAN context, being, denied access to these meetings and therefore denied legitimacy really matters to the generals. They're looking for legitimacy and they're not getting it from ASEAN, of which they're members. So this is pretty significant and something that ASEAN's never done before with any other member. But then it's like, okay, what else can ASEAN do? And this is where ASEAN is really constrained by its own practices. There's a tradition of non-interference in domestic affairs. So kind of like, okay, we're all going to work together to prevent conflicts among the states in ASEAN. But within the states, we're kind of going to just stay out of it for the most part, because otherwise it gets too messy. They're divided on Myanmar. Some, particularly I would say Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, the most democratic of the countries, and Singapore, have been quite outspoken and quite critical of the coup and very outspoken. Others, Vietnam, Laos, to a certain extent Cambodia, they're not democracies. They don't really want to set the precedent of having ASEAN interfere in someone's domestic affairs. Thailand, which would be the most influential as Myanmar's neighbor, has been pretty quiet. Partly maybe their own prime minister took power in a coup in 2014. So my guess is he's not anxious to call out this coup. At the same time, though, they recognize that that what's happening in Myanmar makes the whole organization look bad. So they're really struggling and they don't know what to do. They don't have a lot of tools, a lot of leverage. They don't use sanctions. They could in theory expel Myanmar, but they're really unlikely to do that or even suspend it. Why? They don't want to set the precedent. And then they fear that if they do that, Myanmar will it will have no choice but just to turn to China. And Russia, by the way, Russia is happy to arm the generals in Myanmar. So ASEAN's still talking a good game, but probably not able to do a whole lot. And then even if you look at these ASEAN 5 points, they sound good in theory, but they're not really the path forward. And this is my personal view. They say we need a dialogue. There's no dialogue to be had. The military is not interested in a dialogue at all. And the people don't want to have some negotiation that ends in a compromise that keeps the military in some level, at some level of power. They want the military out. And neither side is interested at all in dialogue right now. So a dialogue sounds great, and we diplomats always preach dialogue. But if the conditions aren't right, it's kind of a waste of time to call for it. My own view is that dialogue may be necessary if and when the military gets weakened to the point that they look for a way out. that they start getting desperate to save the institution. But we're not there yet, and we don't know if we will be there. So it's a bit of a problem that a lot of people are repeating this 5 points as if it's some kind of magical elixir. It's not. And I don't blame ASEAN for that. There's not a lot of good choices, but it's something to keep in mind. Let me finish by the prospects, talking about the prospects for Myanmar. In the short term, I don't know anyone who's optimistic in the short term. We're almost certainly going to see more of what we've been seeing: widespread violence, suffering, brutality by the military, increased violence and attacks also by these People's Defense Forces against the military, with little chance of a ceasefire or dialogue, continued instability, continuing economic downturn, significant downturn. Humanitarian crisis is going to get worse. People are going to be malnourished, without homes, in some cases starving. Some of the ethnic armed groups are using the crisis to assert greater political control in the areas that they were occupying before, because the military is stretched so much that it can't counter them. So there's a possibility that some of these will become de facto states, maybe not officially, but de facto independent states, which is a risk because you don't really want the country starting to fall apart. Could well see more armed groups getting involved. I don't think the military is going to be able to control and govern the country effectively. So I don't think they're going to be able to defeat the resistance. I don't think the resistance is going to be able to defeat the military, at least not militarily. There is hope, and I stress hope, not expectation, that all the pressure on the military, from sanctions that we and others are imposing, from the civil disobedience movement, from the People's Defense Forces, the ethnic armed groups, the lack of international support, at some point the hope is that some in the military will say, this isn't viable, we need to find a way out of this mess. I don't know if that's going to happen, and sometimes it's hard to know if it's my wishful thinking that leads me to think it might happen, or if it's a realistic scenario. But it's the only hopeful way I see out of this situation. And if the military does decide at one point, because of the pressure, to get back in the barracks or lose a lot of its power, then the hard part begins, because you still have all those problems of an unfinished nation. The distrust, even among the different groups involved in the resistance. You'll have debates about the role of Aung San Suu Kyi versus those who've been active while she's been detained. You have a lack of tradition of compromise within the society. So they got all that going against them. On the other hand, you do have incredible courage and sacrifice by so many people. And there is widespread agreement on a desire for democracy and federalism, even if there's no agreement on what that means in practice. And you're having the beginnings, particularly in the younger generation, of empathy, particularly by the ethnic Burmans or Bamar, toward other ethnic groups who they've been told their whole lives are just troublemakers and rebels. And you see this very openly now, even in some cases, empathy and apologies to the Rohingya community for the way they were treated. It's a hopeful sign. It has a long way to go, but it is the first time I've ever seen this. So it's a very difficult road ahead, but there is some reason for hope. I'll stop there and love to hear your questions.
Thank you, Scott. That was terrific. That maybe we can take down the share screen. As we do this, we have some questions. Certainly encourage people to submit some more. Let me begin with a question was posed very early, that the name of the country, Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, kind of like the artist formerly known as Prince. What's the significance of the name of this entity? What it was called, what it is called?
Yeah, so Burma was the colonial name given by the Brits, probably reflecting the ethnic minority group, ethnic majority Bamar, who the Brits called Burmans, so they called it Burma. In 1989, the military dictatorship at the time said, Burma is a colonial name. We don't like it. We're going to call it Myanmar instead, which is much more representative of the whole country, not just the Burmans. The trouble with that is twofold. One, for most non-Burma, Myanmar is no better than Burma. It to them still means the ethnic Burmans or Burma. We, the United States and the UK, decided at that point at Aung San Suu Kyi's request not to recognize the name because the name change was made by an illegitimate military dictatorship. Now, when Aung San Suu Kyi took power, I went to her and I said, okay, now you're calling it Myanmar. Everybody calls it Myanmar. Do you want us to change? She said, do whatever you want. I don't care. Doesn't matter. But some folks in Washington were resistant to that. So that's why we still call it officially Burma. I call it Myanmar. I never call it Burma. But it's, in the great scheme of things, it's not a big deal, but it does reflect that lack of sense of nation. There's not even agreement among all the people in the country what they should call it.
Let me ask a follow-on question of my own, and it does flow from the concept of what to call this place. That I started to study Burma, it was then called, 3 years after the '62 coup. And this was one of the prime examples of the exercise we came to call nation building. How to forge a single nation out of lots of disparate groups in accord with apparently the goals of Aung San, the father of modern Burma. But does this make sense as a country? Should Burma go the way of Yugoslavia, hopefully without the violence, but a recognition that it's just too diverse, it's just too disparate, that the alienation, the antagonism, the animosity impedes progress by everybody. But that I haven't heard a floating of that kind of idea in decades. It's just off the table.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd answer it in two parts. One, there is some reasonable chance that they never can get it together and constitute a really unified country very well because of the distrust. And I mean, the problem really, in my view, has been that, again, the Burma elite have insisted on a Burma-dominated place and been unwilling to give some autonomy to the ethnic minority groups who, for the most part, while they might say we want independence, privately will say, no, we want autonomy. The trouble with a Myanmar that sort of divides a la Yugoslavia is A, it's hard to imagine it happening without massive violence. B, all those small areas, those small states, if you will, that would hive off from Burma, they wouldn't be viable on their own. And they would pretty much all come to depend almost totally on China. You already have a couple of basically Chinese enclaves in the country. I was talking to a pastor up in northeastern Kachin state, right up by the Chinese border, and he said, we want independence. I said, if you have independence, you'll be a vassal state of China within weeks. You're small. So I don't see any way it would be viable. I think if you look at Indonesia, you see an example of a country with similar levels of diversity that could, and some centrifugal forces in the past, but they've managed to build a sense of nation for the most part, with a few minor exceptions. And so I think it's possible, but we're going to need to see a lot more sensitivity and empathy from the majority Burma for it to happen.
A question posed from Nancy Fimble. What are Aung San Suu Kyi's goals for the country? Let me add to that question about the goals of the military, which used to be described as holding the country together, that maintaining the unity was the preeminent goal, is overtaken or supplemented by greed. particularly among the generals. But would you address that? What are the
Yeah.
competing visions for Myanmar?
Yeah, for the military, I think it's pretty clear. It's power. And they have convinced themselves over decades of listening to their own propaganda that their power is inseparable from keeping the country unified. So that's the justification. Yeah, they want to maintain power for greed and all the benefits that it brings them. And I think they have brought themselves really to believe that, you know, brutalizing the ethnic minorities is the appropriate way to make that happen. Aung San Suu Kyi is tougher to say. She's a hard person to really figure out, I've found. She's very smart. She can be incredibly charming. She can be incredibly difficult. And I think she wants a democratic, unified Myanmar, in which the military is answerable to civilian authorities and can no longer go around and just, you know, with impunity, brutalize the population. I really believe that she wants that. However, she's not a big fan of dissent. And she also, to me, sort of had some of the same, what I would call Bamar chauvinism that many other ethnic Bamar have shown, and a lack of sensitivity to the grievances of ethnic minorities. I'm not saying that she's hostile to them or wants them to be abused or anything, don't get me wrong, but sort of a paternalistic approach. I don't know if, can a woman be paternalistic? I don't want to get myself in trouble getting down that road, but you know what I mean, I think. So I think her vision is a lot better than the military's vision, but it's, in my view, still somewhat flawed.
Question from Peter Panfili. What are the sources of weaponry for both the military and for the armed groups that are fighting it?
The military they actually manufacture most of their small arms in the country. But like jet fighters, artillery, tanks, that sort of thing, China and Russia, mostly. Some from Serbia, a little bit from Ukraine, but mostly Russia and China. The ethnic armed groups, it's a range. China arms one of the biggest, most powerful ethnic armed group, the United Wa Army, which is right on the Chinese border. They're heavily involved in drug manufacturing and distribution. And they don't really fight with the military because the military doesn't want to take them on. There's reason to believe that a fair number of those weapons get sold on or transferred on to different ethnic groups. Whether this is at China's, bidding, or China's just pretends not to know, it's hard to say. China's probably almost certainly arming some of the others. Others, buying it on the black market, seized from the military. In the old days, maybe they got some from Thailand. I don't think that really happens much anymore, not officially anyway. So a variety of means.
Ask a question of my own about the relationship to China, relationship to Japan. Is that as the military became more and more brutal, the US and Europeans began to disengage, leaned on Japan to be less engaged than it was. The military turned to China, which was prepared to step into a now vacant playing field, creating dependence, which, as you indicated in the talk, made the military uncomfortable, maybe as the primary factor that led them to open up the political system. But would you take it wherever you think appropriate to discuss the role of outside powers, outside countries?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the UK as the former colonial power still has, well, before the coup, still had a certain amount of influence, particularly because Aung San Suu Kyi lived there for many years with her British husband. But China certainly has the most influence, the most access. They had worked closely, as you indicated, with the military dictatorship before the reforms began. But then when the reforms began and the Aung San Suu Kyi government was elected, I have to say the Chinese were pretty nimble. And they acted as if they had supported democracy all along, and did a lot of travel and cozying up to Aung San Suu Kyi and her ministers, and promising lots of investments in infrastructure, which the country really needed, major trading partner. So they're quite influential. Their relationship with the military is problematic. On the one hand, as you said, the military relied on them and now is relying on them again. But at least senior levels of the military don't trust them. This Min Aung Hlaing and the other senior generals, many of them spent their formative years in the military in the Northeast fighting against the Chinese-backed Communist Party of Burma. They still remember that.
Mhm.
So let me just say the military has no illusions about the Chinese. The country as a whole, it's a mixed bag. Right now, China's in disfavor because there's a perception in the country, rightly or wrongly, that China backed the coup. I don't think China wanted the coup to happen, but they're certainly working with the junta. That's making them pretty unpopular. But they're certainly still the most influential country. Japan traditionally has been very influential. General Aung San in the 1940s, Aung San Suu Kyi's father, he basically got Japanese training in World War II for him and his colleagues to create the Burma Independence Army, which fought alongside the Japanese against us and the Brits. So those ties go way back. By the way, near the end of the war, Aung San saw the tide turning and switched sides, and joined the Brits against the Japanese. But there's still a sense of a pretty close relationship. The Japanese, when I was there, had a very good relationship with both Aung San Suu Kyi and her government and the military. Since then, they've taken a relatively hard line by Japanese standards vis-a-vis the military, but still have some engagement. Their primary focus is to try to block more Chinese influence. South Korea has a lot of commercial and cultural influence, less political influence. And then the various ASEAN states, certainly Singapore has quite a bit of, and Thailand have a certain amount of influence. India as well is a big neighbor. And India also has been hesitant to criticize the military coup.
A question from Linda Grossman that asks if you could say more about Aung San Suu Kyi's unhelpful posture vis-a-vis the Rohingya, what her calculus may have been, what people expected her to do, what constituencies and audiences she was playing to.
Yeah, this brings up a lot of really bad memories for me, I have to say. It took me, I spent months during this Rohingya crisis trying to understand the thinking on the Myanmar side, and I'm not sure I ever did. I don't like to admit that because my job was to understand it, but it was really hard to understand. There is certainly a widespread feeling in the country that the Rohingya don't really belong. I won't waste your time, but I'll try to say very concisely if I can. Over the decades of military rule, they've created this way of thinking about identity and nationality that's very foreign to us, in which your ethnic identity is really important. And some people, some ethnic communities are what they literally call national races. Not only the Bamar, but many of the other ethnic minority groups. And others, the Rohingya, the Gurkhas from Nepal, Chinese, are not national races. In other words, they don't really belong. And it gets really ugly and starts conjuring up images of the 1930s very quickly in my mind, and I think in a lot of people's minds. So there's a sense that they don't belong and that they're a threat. Again, the propaganda has been, if we aren't careful, a wave of Muslims from, 150 million person Bangladesh is just going to sweep over our borders, and we're going to lose our Buddhist soul. And really well-educated progressive people often believe this. I was stunned. So that prejudice toward the Rohingya is very, very deep. The only thing I could ever compare it to was what I imagined the deep south of the United States in the 1940s or 50s, maybe. So there was that. Then from the beginning of the crisis came a steady stream of propaganda that ARSA, this small Rohingya group that had carried out these attacks, was a terrorist group linked to ISIS, and that the military was just doing what other militaries do, fighting back to protect the country from terrorism. So there was a whole alternative reality presented in the newspapers every day. And this came mostly from the military, but to a certain extent from the civilian government. So I think after some time, I think Aung San Suu Kyi and the people around her, because I talked to them all the time, they really believed that somehow the world was buying a false propaganda campaign led by the Organization of Islamic Countries and others who were trying to, turn against Myanmar on behalf of the Rohingya. They convinced themselves of this whole conspiracy theory, and I really think a lot of them bought it. And it was baffling to me, mind-boggling. But that's what we saw, and that's what we heard.
I remember I had global portfolio at the time where the first Rohingya began to show up in Bangladesh. And my reaction articulated at the time was, we got to find out more about what is happening. How bad does it have to be for people to flee into Bangladesh, the poorest countries in the world?
Yeah.
But I mean, we simply didn't know very much about that group, that part of Burma. I wonder if you could say something about Burma's economy. That at the time of independence, 1947, it was the wealthiest country in East Asia on a per capita basis. It's well endowed with all kinds of resources. It has oil and gas. It takes remarkably incompetent leadership to turn a country that had the promise of Burma into the problems of Myanmar. But along with your optimism that you ended with, I would guess that the economy and the potential has got to be a part of it.
Yeah, you're right. In the 50s and up until the coup in 1962, Myanmar was doing relatively well economically, and I would say socially, education levels and all those sorts of things, relatively speaking, to the rest of Southeast Asia and even to a lot of the rest of Asia. It was actually, Rangoon was the Pan Am hub going into Southeast Asia. Johns Hopkins University had a satellite university in Rangoon. It was pretty good. It was the largest rice producer in the region. So it's still a poor country, but relatively speaking, was doing pretty well. And under General Ne Win, who led the coup in '62, he did, as you suggested, he did about everything you could do to ruin an economy. First, in a nationalist peak, he pushed out most of the ethnic Indian population, many of whom were small store owners and business owners. He closed down foreign education institutions, including a lot from the US. He basically turned the Burmese path to socialism and turned it into basically a little bit of an autarky, right? Basically shut off most of the trade from the world. And then over the years, the generals were making all the economic decisions. Generals who didn't know anything about the economy. They were telling, even in the 80s and 90s, telling farmers what to plant, how much fertilizer to use, all these things. And it just ruined it. Multiple exchange rates. And then the generals would and their crony business partners would basically exploit the natural resources, timber, jade, rubies, gold in some cases, just exploited it like crazy and made a lot of money for themselves, but the rest of the economy was bereft. So the reforms that began in 2011 got the economy going again. It was growing at 6.5%, 7% a year. You're seeing a lot of increase in agricultural productivity as financing became available to small farmers, and they could rent equipment to increase productivity. Things like that were making a big difference. So it was a little bit like Vietnam in the early 90s when I was there. When you're doing everything wrong economically, and then you start to do a handful of things right, you get a big bounce from that. And that's what we were seeing. But of course, now the coup has demolished that. There is still a lot of prospect. It's a young society. Education levels up until the coup were improving. People were getting a lot of chances to travel abroad, get educated abroad, develop international connections. So I think it could develop, but you can't do anything until they get the military back in place.
It's a lead-in for the next question. What would it take to weaken the military's grip on the nation, or to persuade military leaders it's time to get out of the way?
That's the big unknown, because we can't really assume rational actors here. Myanmar, Burmese culture is really uncompromising. I'll give you an anecdote that explains it to me better than anything else I've ever heard. Years ago, before the reforms, I was talking to the Thai ambassador to the United States, who had previously been ambassador to Myanmar. And he told me about meeting with one of the top generals in Myanmar. And they were talking about the colonial period. And the Myanmar general was really being very critical of Thailand. And the ambassador said, well, wait a minute, Thailand, we're very proud of the fact that we're the only Southeast Asian nation not to have been colonized. He said the general turned to him and said, yes, you weren't colonized because you gave the foreigners everything they wanted. They might have colonized us, but they had to kill us to do it. He said, that's Burmese culture. That's the culture of the military. And that's true in everything I've seen. They're absolutely, they want to go down with the ship, even if the ship's not sinking. It's incredible. So I think it'll take a lot, but I don't see another way. And to answer the question more directly, I think it takes a combination of intense financial pressure, that they're really being squeezed, problems for their families. Now, some people in Myanmar have saying, maybe we should take out the family members. I don't want to suggest I'm condoning that, but just a lot of social pressure. The civil disobedience movement, and this is where it gets really tricky. The People's Defense Forces, they're putting a lot of military pressure on the military. At the same time, it's hard to be a fan of violence. But the reality is, the fact is that it's putting pressure. I think the hope would be that the combination of all these pressures and the lack of legitimacy, international legitimacy given to the military, at some point, there's some people in the military who are patriotic enough that they say, we got to get out of this mess. Now, I'm not saying these people would turn out to be Jeffersonian democracies, but they do want to preserve the institution. And if they think the institution of the military is at risk, they might be willing to take action to push out the leadership. But anyone who tells you that that's likely or probable, that's wishful thinking. It's a hope.
A contrast between Ukraine and Myanmar now is that we and Europeans are pouring substantial arms into Ukraine to resist the Russians. Is anybody either currently providing arms to the resistance, opposition to the military, And is anyone likely to do that?
Yeah. I don't know of any governments that are doing it, at least not officially. I think people are worried about making the conflict worse. B, you'd have to get those arms in through Thailand or Laos or China or India, or Bangladesh, all of which are problematic. Third, unlike Ukraine, Ukraine, you've got a democratically elected government. You've got a these arms would not be going to the National League for Democracy, the elected members. I'm not saying the people who are engaged in the fighting are evil people, but it's not the same. You got China right there, and that's always going to make people nervous. So I don't know what discussions might be happening in Washington or other capitals on this front, or whether there are any such discussions, but certainly nothing that I've seen that comes out of them.
And I don't have other questions in the queue, but let me, in the time remaining, shift to ASEAN. That it has been suggested that ASEAN's inability to deal with what's happening in Myanmar, even on what some would characterize as a no-brainer of keep representatives of the junta out, that this might be the proverbial straw that breaks the back of ASEAN, demonstrate it's outlived its utility. It simply doesn't have a role to play. Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's easy to be critical of ASEAN. I would say a couple things. First, some of the criticism is warranted, and you even see it from think tankers and academics in Southeast Asia. Second, I think it's not like there's an obvious way forward for ASEAN. I mean, yeah, they could say, well, you're not coming to any meetings, which they're already basically saying to the junta, but it's not that there's something they could do that would solve the problem. It's the rest of the world's grappling with that too. And third, what I would say is that ASEAN can be frustrating at times because it's a consensus organization. Getting 10 countries to agree on anything is very difficult. But I think if you look back at ASEAN over the 55 years that it's been in existence, it's done some really useful things. I mean, it's not a coincidence that there's been really no land wars, no interstate conflict in Southeast Asia, at least between ASEAN members, since the founding of ASEAN. There was, the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, but they weren't ASEAN members at the time. I think there's something to be said for that. And it does help. It's built a lot of ties among all the countries economically as well as politically. So I think it serves a very useful purpose, but, to use the overused expression, it is what it is. Mm-hmm. And it's not likely to become a dramatically more effective player in international diplomacy.
That building on that, and on a comment you made at the beginning of the talk about ASEAN centrality, that remembering back to my days in government, thinking about ASEAN centrality in basically three ways. One, when do you want ASEAN centrality? One set of instances is when you don't want anything to happen. That if the ASEANs are in charge, in control, the East Asian NATO idea, no action, talk only, that live with the status quo because other things don't look. The second was you want ASEAN to be sort of at the helm because you don't want anybody else to be, and you're not prepared to do it yourself. The third is getting closer to what you were suggesting, so that's why I draw it out, which is ASEAN has the potential to do a lot of useful collaboration and coordination on infrastructure construction, not to build it, but to figure out what ought to connect to what, in what sequence, how that would link to efforts to rewrite legal codes and tax policy to attract investment, to build economies of scale, that it, in theory, could do a lot of positive things that it never seems to get around to. That opportunity to take this wherever you want to go on ASEAN.
Yeah. Yeah, ASEAN centrality is a tricky thing. And ASEAN centrality, according to, in theory, means that ASEAN takes the lead on solving regional problems. The critics say, yeah, except you actually don't have a very good track record of solving any of those regional problems. Yeah, true. My view of ASEAN centrality is more, the advantage of ASEAN centrality is ASEAN convenes. ASEAN convenes all the big powers in Asia. And the advantage of that is to kind of play off your point, Tom, is that ASEAN's not a threat to anybody. So if ASEAN calls a meeting to talk about an issue, China, the US, Russia, Japan, Korea, Australia, we all go. And nobody worries that there's some horrible hidden agenda. If we called a meeting, the Chinese called a meeting, the Japanese called a meeting, there's gonna be all these suspicions and so on. So they're kind of the neutral, non-threatening party that plays a useful role to be as the place where everybody can gather and discuss issues. So they're like the secretariat that doesn't have much power, but it's a useful, group of people to bring everyone together, as opposed to the dictator who says, this is what we're going to do. And then among themselves, as you said, they're slowly cutting, reducing barriers to trade and investment, building a broader range of ties, and as you suggested, have the potential to work together, collaborate a lot more on infrastructure and the like across borders. So I think there's a lot for them to do and a lot that they are doing.
Well, thank you, Scott. But not seeing any more questions and seeing that we're almost at the end of the prescribed hour and a half. Thank you for a terrific presentation, and to all of those who have tuned in. Scott is a demonstration yet again of the reasons that we should all be very proud of the people who serve our nation in the Foreign Service, spending much of their careers outside of the United States, dealing with difficult, if not completely intractable problems, and maintaining a high degree of civility and humanity in doing it. So thank you, Scott, both for the substance of the presentation and for your representation of the Foreign Service in your final weeks of active duty.
Thanks, Tom.
A reminder that next week's topic is Xi Jinping, or China, and the Quad alliance, and the speaker will be me. I had initially hoped that have somebody else to do that, but I'm delighted to address this topic next week. Lou, are there any final administrative matters you want to put on before us?
I don't think so. Just to remind everybody that we will post this as soon as we can, the recording during the week. Hopefully that'll be by Wednesday. And then you should be getting an email on Thursday with a little more information about next week's session and a reminder of registration. So I think that's it.
Good. Well, again, thank you, Scott, and thank you
Thanks.
all for joining us, and hope to see many of you next week.
Thanks very much, Scott.
Thank you, Lou.